Hello and welcome to the arcade. You know, video games and tennis go way back. Together, I mean. According to many video game historians, Tennis for Two was actually the very first video game ever created. And Pong, which is sort of a tennis simulator, was the first commercial video game ever released to the public. Turns out a lot of early video game developers loved making a ball bounce back and forth across the screen. And even though it has nothing to do with tennis, Tetris, invented by Alexei Pajitnov, got its name because it combines the words tetra, which means four, and the word tennis, which was his favorite sport, to make the name of one of the most influential and greatest video games of all time. Tetris.
But you know what else also goes way back with video games? Tabletop RPGs like Dungeons & Dragons. I once heard somebody say that virtually all video games are just trying to get back to what D&D already does. And you know what? I kind of agree with that. Ideally, during a game of D&D, you are fully immersed in a fantasy world, taking on the role of a wizard, a warrior, a rogue, or a paladin, teaming up with your friends and battling the evil forces that threaten to take over the magical land of whatever your DM called it. There are some very obvious examples of video games trying to emulate D&D, like Baldur's Gate 3 or Final Fantasy. But you really can see it in a lot more games than that. The Legend of Zelda, Dark Souls and Elden Ring, Skyrim, Disco Elysium, The Witcher, and even Star Wars, Knights of the Old Republic. All of these games have something in common: choice. Whether it be the choice to build your character, how you want them to look, spec them out with the right balance of stats, or even choices in games like dialogue options, story decisions, exploratory freedom, really the list goes on and on. The freedom of choice that there is one of the biggest things that defines what an RPG is.
And now you're probably wondering why I've left off the most obvious type of video game that shares so much in common with RPGs. You're probably sitting there scratching your head or screaming at your screen right now. You're thinking of the most obvious answer that you are just begging me to say, to talk about, to elaborate on further. I mean, it's so obvious that I don't even need to say it. So, until next time. Tennis games! Tennis games are RPGs! Okay, so we're all in agreement then? Alrighty. Until next time. Now hold on a second. Are you telling me that's not what you were screaming at your screen 10 seconds ago? You really expect me to believe that you weren't screaming that tennis games are RPGs? Oh wow. I really didn't expect that from you of all people. Well, since I can't let you embarrass yourself the next time somebody asks you, what are RPGs again? You better sit down and pay close attention for the next 10 minutes while I explain to you exactly how tennis games are just RPGs in disguise, albeit a very thinly veiled disguise.
Now, some of the more enlightened among us may already be thinking, of course there are tennis RPGs. There's Mario Tennis for the Game Boy Color, and there's Mario Tennis Power Tour for the Game Boy Advance. These games have RPG storylines where you play as a young tennis player who just joined a tennis academy and has to make friends, win matches, and level up along the way to ultimately face the greatest challenge of becoming the tennis champion. I could forgive you for jumping to this juvenile conclusion. After all, this video has not yet ended, therefore I have not yet enlightened you to the real truth. For you see, all tennis games, regardless of their storylines, are RPGs. The first example we'll look at is here, Tennis Elbow 2013, the greatest RPG of all time. In this game, you create your own character, you customize his looks, his stats, his temperament, and his playstyle. Is any of this ringing any bells for you yet? Oh, would you look at that, another game where you customize looks, stats, temperament, and playstyle, or role? A role-playing game, perhaps? Well, who could have predicted this? Oh yeah, I did. So, my first point is proven, and there's nothing you can do about it. Both RPGs and tennis games let you create a custom character, customizing their name, their appearance, their stats, style, and their role.
Wait, so that wasn't enough to convince you? Fret not, for I have plenty more where that came from. Let's take a look at this next example.
Progression systems. Every good RPG needs a way to level up, right? And boy, do I have a tennis game for you that meets this very criteria. All of them. In RPGs, you battle enemies to gain experience. Like in Final Fantasy, you can just run around the map until you randomly encounter something to fight to gain some XP. You then use those experience points to level up your character's stats to progress to a higher level and a more fleshed out build or what have you. You level up things like strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma, etc. And smart players put their points into the right stats to craft a specific type of build that works in a certain way for a specific playstyle or role. For example, you wouldn't just randomly throw points around. If you're a wizard, you have no need for brute force or other such Neanderthalian tropes. You would tend to stick all your points into intelligence, casting, or wisdom or something like that, anything that advances your specific role as a wizard. And tennis games have the exact same thing. You play matches against random opponents in tournaments, and depending on how well you do, you gain experience points to level up your stats like power, stamina, control, forehand and backhand, volley, spin, and serve. And like I said for RPGs, you wouldn't just randomly throw points around. If you're a baseliner, you have little need for the volley skill. Or conversely, if you're a serve and volley player, you tend to lean towards things like an accurate serve, quick reflexes, and probably luck in most cases.
So now that I have not proven 1 but 2 whole points, I'm sure that now you're fully convinced that tennis games are RPGs. So until next time. Seriously? Okay, fine, we'll speedrun the last 3 points and then let you decide for yourself, I guess. Jeez.
Next up in my almighty comparisons chart, we have quests and objectives. In RPGs, quests come from many sources, the main two being an overarching storyline and NPCs, or non-player characters. Quests are really the driving force behind advancing through the game, the major stepping stones to get from point A to point Z and actually finish the game. Quests are the most important part of RPGs in my opinion, as they directly affect your specific path through the game you're playing, shaping your story to be as unique as your own character. Of course, some RPGs have a singular linear story, but a lot also have a large amount of freedom of direction and expression for the player. Now, in tennis games, particularly in ones that have a career mode, the player makes tons of different choices to shape their path as a tennis pro. At first, you scrap by playing in basically every tournament you can qualify for. But as you get better and better, you have to decide which tournaments you're going to enter, which coach you're going to hire, and which days you're going to take off, which days you're going to skip playing matches and focus on training a skill or anything else like that. These choices all determine your story as a tennis player and how it all eventually gets you to your goal of winning all the Grand Slams and becoming the world #1. The next pillar of RPGs and tennis games is player choice and consequence. Now, I've already touched on some of this, but let's be clear. RPGs are meant for players to express themselves in virtually any way possible. A good RPG will allow players to make decisions that have real-time, long-lasting consequences, whether those are good or bad. For example, in Mass Effect 2, you might be like I was, so engrossed in the main storyline and so eager to get to the ending that you feel tempted to skip all of the side character quest lines in favor of getting to the end sooner. Well, I won't spoil exactly what happens if you get to the end without progressing any character side quests, but if you know, you know. And if you choose to load your Mass Effect 2 save into Mass Effect 3, that choice of skipping to the end and missing all the character side quests will affect literally the entire game of Mass Effect 3. So just you think about that before you go around skipping side quests. And this example I gave is more of a long-term one than a short-term one. There's another type of choice and consequence to think of in terms of games like maybe Pokemon. In Pokemon, you might want to use your favorite starter Pokemon against everything you fight in the wild or in gyms. But the problem arises when there's a type mismatch. Your little Squirtle isn't going to do anything against Zapdos in the power plant off Route 9. And in tennis games, choices really matter. For example, it may be a viable strategy against most players out there, but if you want to be a serve and volley player or a serve bot, you are going to have a really hard time matching up against someone with a great return and great ability to keep pushing the ball back over the net. A good serve is just not effective against a good return. And finally, the most important part of most RPGs, combat. In games like Dragon Quest or Golden Sun, typically what happens is this. The player and or their party members encounters an enemy in the wild. Then the player and the enemy take turns either attacking, using items, or healing up. It's only fair after all to take turns. So the goal is use your turns to inflict as much damage as you can, dictating the course of the battle, using the best attacks you have, but saving as much as you can in case you encounter more enemies out in the wild, and only using resources like healing when you really need to. And in tennis games, you take turns, hitting the ball back and forth. You're not allowed to hit a ball twice in a row. Your opponent must have their turn to hit the ball back after you have hit it. No cutting in line to the next hit. So you take turns hitting the ball back and forth. You take turns serving, and you take turns from opposite ends of the court. You try to use the best shots you can while also deciding which type of shot works best for the position that you find yourself in, whether due to your opponent's strategy, luck, or any other random thing that might occur during a match. And that's it! Are you starting to see the patterns yet? Tennis games are RPGs. How could they not be? They have all the same building blocks. And sure, you could call them action RPGs since the gameplay feels a little less restrictive than typical JRPGs. Like how you can move around, choose shot direction, sprint, etc., but you still always have to take turns hitting the ball no matter what.
So, what are you going to do now? Are you just not going to believe that tennis games are RPGs? Be warned, everyone will seriously doubt your RPG knowledge if you refuse to accept it. Take my advice, admit this to yourself now, and grow as a person, as a tennis player, and as a gamer. This knowledge is my gift to you. And now that I've convinced you that tennis games are RPGs, I thought I'd give you a little preview into the next D&D campaign that I'm DMing. Take a look.
You squint through the bright lights as you exit the tunnel. The stage is set. Arthur Ashe Stadium, US Open.
Your opponent eyes you from across the court, the Swiss maestro himself.
A bead of sweat falls from your temple and onto your racket handle. You wipe it off and march to the baseline. The announcement booms. Federer to serve. Play.
You nervously grip your racket while you shuffle your feet in place.
You try to keep your eye on the ball as he bounces it up and down, but you're too intimidated by your foe, and you start to lose focus.
Suddenly, with his left hand, he flings the fuzzy yellow orb aloft.
Then delivers a mighty strike to it with his Wilson Pro Staff. It flies towards you at 120 miles per hour. What do you do?
What side of my body is the serve coming to?
His disguise is too great. In the moment, you cannot tell. You must guess.
Backhand return cross court?
Fine.
Yes, 19, let's go! You fool! The serve was to the body.
The fuzzy yellow orb strikes clean and true, piercing your chest as you collapse in a broken heap on the court.
The whole stadium chants his name. Federer, Federer, Federer.
And it's the last thing you hear before you die.
Whatever, man. This is the worst campaign I have ever played.
I'm just gonna go play some Tennis Elbow 2013. That's a real RPG.